The First Battle of Bull Run, the first shots fired, how flags, blunders, and battles shaped Bull Run. The American Civil War didn't just appear like an uninvited guest at a family dinner, it had been simmering on the stove for years. Imagine two siblings in a house, one who believes in working in factories and wearing top hats, the North, and the other who's quite fond of plantations and insists on keeping their peculiar institution, the South. Their argument reached a boiling point with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Now, Lincoln wasn't about to end slavery overnight, but the South was convinced he would soon send them a breakup letter. Slavery had to go. In a huff, South Carolina declared it had had enough and bolted from the Union in December 1860. Of course, once the ball started rolling, states like Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas thought, hey, why not, and followed right after. They formed their own club, the Confederate States of America, complete with a president of their own, Jefferson Davis. They were serious now, no turning back, and Lincoln? Well, let's just say his honeymoon as president was about to get bumpy. April 1861, Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor was about to become the most famous piece of real estate in America. The Union soldiers stationed their needed supplies, but Confederate forces, now calling Charleston home, saw this as a big ol' keep out sign. Under the watchful eye of Confederate General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, imagine that name in calligraphy on a birthday cake, they opened fire. Boom. Bang. After 34 hours, the fort surrendered. Lincoln received the message loud and clear, war was officially on. Now, Lincoln's military chief was General Winfield Scott, a man of experience, but also a man of age. At 75, Scott was more suited for a good rocking chair than the battlefield. Still, the old man had a plan, a grand one, in fact, which he called the Anaconda Plan. Like a giant snake, Scott wanted to wrap around the South, blockading their ports and cutting off their resources. His goal? Slowly squeeze the life out of the Confederacy. It wasn't glamorous, but it was clever. Yet Scott's age meant that he wasn't charging into battle himself, and soon it was clear the Union needed younger blood to lead on the ground. As the nation geared up for war, President Lincoln and his cabinet were scrambling to find someone to lead their brand new army. Here's where things got a bit sticky. The most obvious choice to lead the Union forces was none other than Robert E. Lee, a highly respected officer and veteran of the Mexican-American War. In fact, Lincoln personally offered Lee the command of the Union Army. But there was a catch: Lee was a Virginian through and through. When his home state seceded, he simply couldn't bring himself to fight against it, even if he didn't agree with secession. So, he turned down Lincoln's offer and resigned from the Union Army. That decision would change the course of history. With Lee out of the picture, Lincoln needed another man to lead his army. Enter Irvin McDowell, a man thrust into the spotlight despite having minimal battlefield experience. McDowell, a West Point graduate, had been serving in administrative roles. He was far more familiar with paperwork than warfare. But, in the absence of better options, McDowell was appointed to lead the Union forces. McDowell wasn't your typical grizzled soldier. He came from a relatively privileged background, born in Ohio to a prosperous family. He studied at West Point alongside many future Civil War commanders, but his career had been more about logistics than frontline combat. As a young officer, McDowell had served as an aide-de-camp during the Mexican-American War, but his combat experience was limited. His family was well regarded, and he was known as a respectable man, but leading an entire army into battle? Well, that was new territory. To say McDowell was nervous about the task would be an understatement. In fact, he tried to convince Lincoln that his army needed more time to train, famously remarking, "I'm green, they're green, we're all green." But time wasn't on his side. Under pressure from politicians who wanted a swift victory, McDowell was forced to move ahead with his plans. Not everyone in the North was a Lincoln fan. Enter the Copperhead Democrats, a group of anti-Lincoln folks who weren't keen on war. As federal troops from the 6th Regiment marched through the streets of Baltimore on April 19, 1861, tensions exploded. Pro-Southern mobs attacked the troops with stones, clubs, and pistol fire. It was chaos. The soldiers were under siege in their own country. Some soldiers fired back, but 4 federal soldiers and 12 civilians were dead by the time the smoke cleared. Lincoln wasn't about to let his troops be ambushed like this again, so he quickly declared martial law in Maryland. Bridges were burned, roads destroyed by Southern sympathizers hoping to prevent Union forces from passing through. The lines were being drawn. War wasn't just on the battlefield, it was everywhere. On May 24, 1861, Union forces crossed the Potomac River and occupied Alexandria, Virginia. Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, a young, brash officer, was leading the charge. As he gazed upon a Confederate flag fluttering over the Marshall House Inn, Ellsworth saw it as a personal challenge. He stormed into the inn and climbed to the roof to tear down the flag. But he wasn't alone. The innkeeper, James W. Jackson, was waiting with a shotgun. The moment Ellsworth came down with the flag in hand, Jackson shot him point blank, killing him instantly. A soldier in Ellsworth's unit immediately returned fire, killing Jackson. The incident became a rallying cry for both the North and the South. The war had just turned deadly personal. While the rest of Virginia was all about the Confederacy, the mountainous regions of western Virginia were singing a different tune. These folks weren't keen on secession, and many had pro-Union sentiments. It was a case of family members finding themselves on opposite sides of the fence. In fact, the tension got so thick that parts of western Virginia would eventually break away to form West Virginia. In June 1861, Major General George Brinton McClellan was ordered to attack Confederate forces near Grafton, under the command of Colonel George H. Porterfield. McClellan was the ambitious type, eager to prove himself. On June 3, McClellan's forces engaged Porterfield at the Battle of Philippi. Though more of a skirmish than a full-scale battle, it was an early Union victory, and McClellan's star began to rise. The South? Not so much. Later that summer, Robert E. Lee, who had joined the Confederacy but hadn't yet proven himself, was sent to deal with Union forces in western Virginia. It was here that Lee's military brilliance seemed to take a coffee break. He was tasked with leading Confederate forces in a series of small battles, including Rich Mountain. Let's just say, things didn't go well for Lee. His troops were outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and forced to retreat. Lee's less-than-stellar performance led to his being shuffled off to build fortifications instead of leading men into battle. Not exactly the glamorous start to his Confederate career. Meanwhile, back in Virginia, Union forces under General Benjamin Butler were gearing up for what they hoped would be a swift victory at Big Bethel Church. What they got instead was a lesson in how not to coordinate an attack. Union forces fired on their own men in the chaos, and the battle quickly became a disaster. The Confederates, led by Colonel John B. Magruder, easily held their ground. For the Union, it was a humiliating defeat. On the Confederate side, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard had emerged as one of the South's most dynamic military leaders. Born in 1818 to a wealthy Creole family in Louisiana, Beauregard was no stranger to privilege. He was raised on a sugar plantation and educated in Paris, but despite his fancy upbringing, he had a warrior's heart. Like McDowell, Beauregard was a West Point graduate, and he'd served with distinction in the Mexican-American War, where he honed his skills as an artillery officer. By the time the Civil War broke out, Beauregard had already made a name for himself as the hero of Fort Sumter. His natural charisma and military prowess made him an ideal candidate to lead Confederate forces in Virginia. When Confederate President Jefferson Davis needed someone to defend the vital railroad junction at Manassas, Beauregard was the obvious choice. The Confederate strategy was to defend their new capital, Richmond, at all costs. Manassas Junction was a critical point for railroads linking the Confederate heartland, and if the Union forces could capture it, Richmond would be vulnerable. So, Beauregard set up his defenses along Bull Run Creek, a place that would soon become etched in history. Now, why Bull Run, you ask? Bull Run Creek, just a few miles from Manassas Junction, was an ideal defensive position for the Confederates. It offered natural barriers like rivers and ridges, giving Beauregard a chance to dig in and defend against McDowell's approaching Union forces. It was also symbolic in a way. This first clash of arms would happen near a place with a name that sounded like something out of a Wild West novel. Bull Run. The name itself had a rugged, untamed feel to it, much like the war that was about to begin. But Bull Run was more than just a convenient location. It represented the clash of ideologies, of North versus South, of industrial might versus agrarian resolve. The soldiers gathering there, many of whom were raw recruits with just weeks of training, had no idea they were about to make history. It was a bright and promising morning on July 21, 1861. General Irvin McDowell, feeling the heat of Washington politics, had an army of 35,000 Union soldiers ready to march on Confederate forces near Manassas, Virginia. His plan was simple, well, not exactly simple, but in theory, it was genius. He would outflank the Confederate left while launching a diversionary attack on their center. If all went well, they'd be sipping tea in Richmond by nightfall. The problem? Plans and reality don't always play nice, especially when your troops are barely out of boot camp and confused by the sight of anyone wearing gray. On the other side, General P.G.T. Beauregard's Confederate army, some 22,000 strong, wasn't just sitting around waiting to be outflanked. Encamped along Bull Run, Beauregard had his spies hard at work, keeping tabs on McDowell's every move. Among these troops was the Stonewall Brigade, a group of Virginians who would soon get the kind of nickname that sticks forever. But more on that later. Meanwhile, deep in the scenic, and strategically critical, Shenandoah Valley, Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston sat in command of the Army of the Shenandoah. Johnston wasn't just any general, he came from military nobility. Born in 1807 in Virginia, he was the son of Peter Johnston, a hero of the American Revolution, and had military service in his blood. Graduating from West Point in 1829, he served with distinction in the Mexican-American War, earning multiple promotions. By 1861, Johnston was one of the Confederacy's best and brightest. Johnston's troops in the Shenandoah Valley had been tasked with keeping an eye on Union General Robert Patterson's Army of the Pennsylvania Department. Patterson was supposed to stop Johnston from reinforcing Beauregard. Easy, right? Wrong. When Johnston received a telegraph from Richmond ordering him to get his troops over to Manassas, Patterson was left outsmarted and outmaneuvered, his forces never posing a serious threat. Johnston didn't just march his troops down to Beauregard, he used trains. Yep, for the first time in military history, railroads would transport entire armies to battle, and Johnston's soldiers, still in Confederate gray and homespun but now armed with a killer advantage, were on their way to join Beauregard. McDowell's plan for the day was ambitious, if overly complex for his green troops. His army was split into 3 columns. The main attack would be a wide flanking maneuver on Beauregard's left, while a diversionary force would probe the Confederate center at Blackburn's ford. Timing was crucial, and Union officers in blue uniforms gave precise marching orders. But there was one major problem: these guys didn't know how to march properly. Confusion reigned as McDowell's soldiers, fresh-faced volunteers who thought war was like a parade, got hopelessly entangled in the Virginia countryside. Many had uniforms so new that they were still breaking in their boots. Some regiments, like the 11th New York Fire Zouaves, were sporting their flamboyant French-inspired red trousers and fezzes, great for fashion but terrible for battle. The Union Army was, by all accounts, a motley crew. Adding to McDowell's headache, Beauregard's intelligence was better than anyone expected. Thanks to a network of spies and scouts, and maybe a few loose-lipped Union soldiers, Beauregard knew McDowell's plan before McDowell's own troops did. Confederate General Richard S. Ewell, stationed at the critical crossing of Blackburn's ford, was prepared for the Union diversion. Meanwhile, Johnston's reinforcements were quickly making their way to the battlefield. Early in the morning, McDowell's troops stumbled into their positions. As the first shots were fired at Blackburn's ford, disaster struck. A regiment of Union soldiers, mistaking Confederates for their own because of similar uniforms, hesitated. The result? Chaos. The Confederates, in their ragtag gray, but to the Union eyes appearing just gray enough to confuse matters, capitalized on the Union hesitation and fired back with deadly precision. Timing slipped through McDowell's fingers like sand. His carefully planned assault was quickly losing its footing. By late morning, Confederate reinforcements from Johnston's army had arrived, riding the rails right onto the battlefield, a Confederate feat of logistics that caught McDowell off guard. Johnston himself quickly deferred command to Beauregard, but he stayed close to oversee his troops' deployment. Among them was a stern and resolute brigade led by Brigadier General Thomas J. Jackson, a professor-turned-soldier whose unwavering defense that day would earn him the legendary nickname Stonewall. As the Union forces advanced, Jackson's men dug in along Henry House Hill. Confederate artillery thundered across the field, and Jackson, watching the Union forces falter, is said to have uttered, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians." The battle began to tip in the Confederates' favor. By mid-afternoon, McDowell's once confident army began to unravel. Johnston's reinforcements, along with Jackson's indomitable defense, had broken the Union's advance. What had been an orderly retreat soon turned into a panicked rout. Union soldiers, exhausted, confused, and with no idea where to regroup, began running back toward Washington. Amid the chaos, the onlookers, yes, actual picnickers who had come to watch what they thought would be a Union victory, were caught up in the retreat. Wealthy Washingtonians in their finest Sunday dresses and bonnets found themselves swept away with fleeing soldiers, their picnic baskets abandoned as they scrambled to escape the battlefield. The Union defeat at Bull Run was a disaster of epic proportions. For McDowell, the defeat was a career-ending blow. His ambitious plans had been undone by poor timing, miscommunication, and the raw inexperience of his troops. He was quickly replaced by the meticulous, and some would say overly cautious, General George B. McClellan, who would soon whip the Union Army into shape for the long war ahead. Beauregard, Johnston, and Jackson emerged as Southern heroes, but they knew this was only the beginning. The victory, while decisive, hadn't crushed the Union. In fact, it only stiffened Northern resolve. Jackson, now forever known as Stonewall, became a Confederate legend. In Washington, the defeat forced President Lincoln and his administration to face the hard truth: this rebellion was no flash-in-the-pan uprising. It was a full-fledged war, and it would be fought not with fancy maneuvers and quick victories but with grit, blood, and years of brutal combat. I warmly invite you to share your views and opinions in the comment section. Your reflections are more than just reactions to this video, they become part of a living record that future generations can learn from. Every thought, whether about leadership, courage, confusion, or the human cost of war, adds depth to our understanding of history. Please take a moment to leave your perspective so that together we can preserve these stories for education, remembrance, and the generations yet to come. Could McDowell's army have won if Union leaders had given their raw recruits more time to train before marching on Manassas? Did Johnston's use of railroads to rush reinforcements mark the true beginning of modern warfare, or was it just a lucky advantage for the Confederacy? Was Stonewall Jackson's stand the decisive moment that turned the tide, or would the Union have collapsed regardless due to confusion and poor planning? Did the Union defeat strengthen resolve in the North, or did it reveal deeper weaknesses that would haunt them throughout the war? Was Bull Run more symbolic than strategic? Did its outcome truly shape the course of the Civil War, or was it simply the first painful lesson in a long conflict?